Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Kincaid, and welcome to a Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the 3rd day of November. It is an absolutely gorgeous day. Absolutely beyond belief. I think Bob Kincaid, and we were chatting before we were on the air. I think Bob referred to it as stunning, and indeed it is. I mean, we're here in Appalachia. We're in the upper 60s, and the sun is shining, and I'm looking out the window at more leaves than I'll ever be able to rake, and I'm going to take them on, I think, when we go off the air today. But it is an absolutely gorgeous day, perfect day for raking leaves or blowing leaves or whatever we might do. It is a pleasure to be with you on this Tuesday, and of course we're starting 1/2 hour late today. I did want to remind you of that, and I do encourage you to participate actively in our program by giving us a call if you are at all interested. We will have our abbreviated program today. Will be 90 minutes, but would love to hear from you. And I appreciated in chatting before we went on the air, Bob made a couple of comments about yesterday's program, and actually he pretty well gave me an idea as to where I really ought to begin in an effort to try to review and summarize a few things that we talked about yesterday. We do look forward to hearing from you, and we have our phone connection. If you would like to be on the air and make your thoughts known to our other listeners, you can call the phone number at area code 304-640-6495. That's 304-640-6495. If you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906, all lowercase, one word, at gmail.com. I invite you also to visit our Facebook page. If you go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you'll gain access to this page. I've taken to trying to put more things on it over the last 4 or 5 days, and I have done that. And last evening I put a fairly lengthy piece that I had written the night before. I wrote it on Sunday evening, I believe, and it's on higher education, and it's pretty specific to West Virginia. But on the other hand, I thought it was there was enough substantive information in there that it might be of interest to people, even whether in fact they're in West Virginia or not. And to be honest, I'm thinking that clearly not in today's program, but I'm guessing that by the time we get to tomorrow, we may be taking up this particular issue. But I did put a posting on Facebook last evening, and it is fairly extensive, but it says quite a bit about higher education here, specifically in West Virginia. But it really addresses issues in higher education, which are not by any means West Virginia sensitive or West Virginia specific. So, again, we would love to hear from you, whether it's by phone, whether it's on the comments that you might make on the internet, on the Facebook page, or whether in fact it's through an email directly to me. But we would love to hear from you. Yesterday's program, for those of you who were kind enough to be with us, you'll recall, dealt with we completed the financial program of Alexander Hamilton in the early 90s, 1790s, the 5-part program. And we talked a little bit about some of the shenanigans, if you wanted to call it that. Maybe that's not the appropriate word. It's not very academic. It's not very professional, but indeed it's pretty accurate in some cases. We talked about some of the opportunities and some of the issues associated with the various parts of the program in order to get them through. And then towards the end of the program, we spent much of our time focusing specifically on the program in toto. In other words, the program, as a package. And the point, and I think I made this point during the course of the program yesterday as well, Hamilton made it very clear that this was indeed a package, that each portion of it, while it was an independent, separate piece of legislation and could function in and of itself, the fact of the matter is the overall benefits of the program could only be realized if the entire program was enacted. And in fact, this is the argument that Hamilton used, part of the argument that Hamilton used when he first experienced the defeat in Congress of the assumption of state debts for sectional reasons, as we talked about. Since most of the southern states had already paid off their debts, it was natural that southern congressmen tended to vote against the assumption bill, and it was defeated. And that, as we talked yesterday, prompted Jefferson to, and I'm certain that he didn't do it without prodding from Alexander Hamilton, prompted Jefferson to schedule a dinner and invite some of his congressional friends from the district, from the region. I shouldn't say district because we're talking about the origins of Washington, D.C. So when most people hear the term the district, that's what they think of. I didn't mean that. I meant that the congressmen who represented constituencies on either side, the Maryland or Virginia side of the Potomac River, and the issue of the location of the national capital was the prize. And Hamilton committed at this dinner to using his influence among northern congressmen to get the Potomac selected as the permanent site of the national capital in return for, or in exchange for, a few votes from Virginians and Marylanders in favor of assumption. And of course the deal was indeed consummated. Assumption finally did pass, and it became part of the overall program package. I didn't mention yesterday, Bob and I talked about this actually last week, we chatted about it a little bit, but you know, if you're at all familiar with the Potomac, or even can kind of in your mind locate it on a map of the United States, it extends pretty far inland. So naturally the consideration is, if the particular district to be created on the Potomac is to be 10 miles square, then that leaves an awful lot of land on either side of the river to choose from. And so Congress selects a committee made up of representatives and congressmen, representatives and senators rather, to accompany President Washington, who was given the honor as president of selecting the most appropriate site for the location of what becomes Washington, D.C., the district, the new federal district that will house the U.S. Capitol. And the story goes that Washington and the committee rode, on horseback up one side of the Potomac and down the other, trying to find the most appropriate location for the Capitol. And as things would occur, it so happened that the land that they picked and the committee approved was owned by Washington. He picked his own land, I don't necessarily know whether we would consider that conflict of interest or not. But Washington, of course, receives a lot of credit from historians, because throughout the Revolution, even though he was commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, he refused to take a salary. However, it's important to recognize that he did ask that his expenses be covered by Congress. And so his expense log is one of the prizes that historians love to get their hands on, because his expenses at times tended to be fairly extensive. But anyway, this was the location of the national capital, and one of the things that I neglected to mention yesterday, but it's another factor in the consideration of an appropriate location for the national capital. We talked about the jockeying for position in terms of regions, north, south, or in the middle, and the alliances or the cliques or groups or compacts or whatever that was being reached among regions. Alliances, political alliances being made where I'll vote for you if you do this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the other factors that made the selection of the location of the national capital interesting is that most people believed that it really ought not to be on the coast. This is one of the benefits, of course, of the Potomac location, because the Potomac empties into Chesapeake Bay rather than directly into the Atlantic. The assumption was the belief was that if you located the national capital too close to the coast, then the capital became vulnerable to attack from a foreign power. So the thinking was that it had to be somewhat inland in order to be adequately defended. And that's one of the other things that played into the hands of the Potomac location. But anyway, the point that we made is that, sometimes the old adage about the forest and the trees, if you spend too much time on the specific portions or specific provisions of Hamilton's program, sometimes we tend to lose the value or the benefit of the overall package as a whole. And Hamilton was very, very adamant that his program be considered that way. We talked quite a bit about the extent to which there's absolutely no question that politics played a significant role in Hamilton's program. It was in part at least designed, it's a little bit difficult to say how much or what percentage was political, what percentage was economics, but there's absolutely no question that Hamilton's program was designed to bring political opportunity or political advantage to certain groups of people through speculation, the creation of the bank, the establishment of a tariff program to protect manufacturers, and all the rest of it. But Hamilton's emphasis, and again, I want to emphasize this because it's important, is to recognize that this is the initial administration under the Constitution of the United States. These are the first few years of a new government. And there's no question that Hamilton's overall program is designed to put the new nation on a solid footing, not only politically, but economically as well. And so Hamilton realizes that in order to make this whole effort successful, it's necessary to win the support of the most important, influential people in the nation. And the inclusion of opportunities for speculation plays right into that. And so there's no question. I recommend a book that was published a number of years ago. I have a copy right here. I think it was published in about 1950s or 60s, but let me be a little bit more specific if I can. The publication date is 1956. And the title of the book is The Origins of the American Party System. And the author is Joseph Charles. It's an old book, but it's a very valuable book. And one of the things, those of you who are regular listeners here at the Virtual Center will understand what I'm talking about. In the attention that we have paid to the so-called progressive school of historians, Charles Beard's economic interpretation of the Constitution, and then the group of historians that followed in Beard's footsteps. In other words, from that particular perspective, there's absolutely no question that Joseph Charles was one of those. When you read this book, you don't have to read in it too far to see the influence of Charles Beard's research in Joseph Charles's study. And what he's looking at is the origins of the party system. And in the initial sections of his, it's a very small book, it's less than 200 pages. But Charles has done quite a bit of legwork and has dug out an awful lot of the very specific information about Hamilton's program. And because this is a program under the new Constitution, under the new federal government, the records are pretty accurate. And as we mentioned with funding and assumption, the way that the program worked was that you brought in certificates that were awarded for a particular face amount. And it's kind of like an IOU. The way I usually explained it in classes I taught, because people used to be able to relate to that, although I'm talking about savings bonds, U.S. savings bonds, what used to be Series E bonds. These were a lot more popular several years ago than they are now. But it used to be in a college class, if you mention a savings bond, most students knew exactly what you were talking about because they were a very popular way to invest. And of course, what you would do is the bonds would be sold, savings bonds would be sold in increments of $25, $50, $100, $500, $1,000, etc. And youngsters in school, I can remember when I was in grade school in the 50s, that we were encouraged to save and to invest in bonds. And I can remember there used to be a stamp program. And you would get a book of stamps, and you would bring each week on a particular day, you would bring money to school to buy stamps. I know my dad used to make sure that I had at least a quarter. A stamp, I believe, was a quarter. And the whole idea was that when you filled a book of stamps, it could be converted into a $25 savings bond. But the fact of the matter is the $25 on the face value of the bond was after the interest accrued. You only paid, I believe it was $18.25 or $18.50 or something like that. In other words, $7 of the $7 plus of the $25 was interest. So when you filled one of these books of stamps, you brought it to the bank, and you turned the book in, and you received a certificate, a bond, a savings bond. And the face value of that bond was $25, but you had to wait until it matured, until the interest accrued. At the end of that, you would get $25. And of course, it was at the time, it was a practice. People used to give bonds for Christmas gifts and birthday gifts and graduation gifts and everything else. And I know a number of people who are of my generation who ended up with a fairly substantial amount of investment in bonds, in savings bonds. But this explains exactly the way Hamilton's funding program worked. Because what you would do is you would bring in, instead of a book of stamps, you would bring in the certificate, whether it was a certificate signed by the Congress under the Articles of Confederation, if it was a national certificate, or a state certificate if it was signed, if it applied to a particular state. And you would bring it in, and it would have a face value on it, and you would be issued a new bond under Hamilton's program, and the amount that you were issued was the face value of the certificate you brought in plus the interest. And most of the interest, most of the states, most of the programs that I was familiar with offered interest of 6%, which is, of course, is pretty lucrative. But if you just had one bond, one $25 bond, it really wasn't, you couldn't call that speculation because, getting 4 or 5 $25 bonds was not really significant investment or financial opportunity. But if you were able to lay your hands on 500 or 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 of these certificates and turn them all in at the same time and were issued these new certificates, then you basically pocketed a fairly healthy piece of change in interest. And that's really the point of speculation, because certain people who were in on the information were able to take advantage of this. And that really was part of Hamilton's overall intent, was to make this lucrative opportunity available to certain people in order to wed them financially to the new government. And in Joseph Charles's book, The Origins of the American Party System, he digs out some of the specific information. And he points out, for example, that Hamilton was married to a Schuyler, a New York Schuyler, a very prominent family in New York politics. And there are a number of Schuylers who turn in substantial amounts of certificates under this program. In other words, this is obviously insider trading. Hamilton is giving out the word to family members to speculate. And we even, I shared with you the letter written by Andrew Craigie, the Boston financier at the time, who took up in a rooming house in New York with 6 members of the New England congressional delegation in order that he could follow the process of funding an assumption through Congress. And Craigie points out that before they passed the legislation, Congress declared a recess so that many members had time to go home and speculate, or to go home and spread the word among particular friends of theirs that there was a financial opportunity here if they really got to it. And so the fact of the matter is, Joseph Charles has some of these numbers in there. I mean, many of them, the dollar figures, $20,000, $25,000, $28,000, $35,000. And of course, we're talking in a period when that was a significant amount of money. And that again is the whole point. But it's important again to recognize Hamilton's total program. It was a government program designed to promote economic development, designed to get the economy off the ground, so to speak. And that meant that certain sectors of the economy, like manufacturing, had to be subsidized because we were so far behind in our ability to manufacture that if you wanted to create or develop an independent manufacturing capability within the United States, then government subsidies, government support was necessary to make this work. And so what manufacturers looked for is government putting a high tariff on foreign imports. And I don't mean to get off the mark a little bit, but it seems like perhaps an appropriate time to make this point. Those of you who remember Thomas Jefferson's administration, especially his second administration, 1804 to 1808, when we begin to move more and more closer to what becomes the War of 1812 when Madison is in office. One of the big controversies, foreign policy controversies in the Jefferson administration was the outbreak, once again, of warfare between England and France, and the extent to which the United States would throw its support to England, or whether in fact it would throw its support to France. And Thomas Jefferson promoted a series of foreign policy moves that historians have concluded were terrible mistakes. You may remember pieces of legislation from your school days, as it were, where we had, for example, in 1807, Congress passes what is called the Embargo Act. And what that means is Jefferson gets legislation through Congress forbidding trade, shutting down the commercial capability within the United States, on the assumption that European nations were so dependent on American agriculture that they would come to the table and meet our terms if they were threatened with the denial of trade with us. And this became the major controversy within the Jefferson period, the major debate between Federalists and Jeffersonians. And that was whether in fact America's best financial decisions were to ally ourselves with England, or whether in fact we would be better off supporting France. And of course, at this time, we're talking about the emergence of Napoleon in France. The point is that Jefferson's manipulation, one of the pieces of legislation is called the Non-Intercourse Act, where what the United States does is it pledges that we will trade as a neutral. We have the right to trade with whomever we want, except the two belligerents, France and England. But in this particular legislation, Congress puts a provision in there that if one or the other, either France or England, agrees to stop interfering with our shipping and respecting our rights as a neutral, then we will resume trade with them. In other words, we're using trade with us, in Jefferson's mind, as a bargaining chip. It turns out that the economy suffers a terrible blow because effectively Jefferson shuts down the economic vigor of the nation in this particular situation. Jefferson, as many of us know, was an advocate of the nation remaining predominantly agricultural. Jefferson was very suspicious of large urban areas, of big cities. He had spent a lot of time in France. He had been there during the start of the French Revolution, and he was very aware and said in more places than you can count in his writings, in his letters, that big cities are dangerous because that's where revolutions happen. That's where large numbers of people are concentrated, as he pointed out, on top of each other. And so if there are financial tough times, if there's unemployment and starvation and all of this, then the fact that they're all packed together in an urban area makes political revolution much more likely. So Jefferson's belief was that the nation would benefit from remaining predominantly agricultural. The problem with that is that if you don't have large commercial areas, large urban areas, then you become woefully deficient in manufacturing because by definition, factories and factory workers congregate in urban areas. So the question that Jefferson had to confront is, how do we satisfy our manufacturing needs if we push toward maintaining a predominantly rural agricultural nation? And Jefferson's conclusion or response to that is that we can continue to buy the manufactured goods we need from manufacturers elsewhere in the world. In other words, we can continue to buy British manufacturing goods, manufactured goods. And Jefferson's point is that the benefits outweigh the costs. Yes, we would be dependent on prices over which we had no control. They would be set in England. We'd be vulnerable to ups and downs of the market in terms of price, yes. But the upside is we wouldn't have the large urban areas and we wouldn't be confronted with the threat of social and political internal discord and revolution. In other words, the stability of the nation would be maintained by remaining agricultural, by remaining rural. And that's why in 1803 Jefferson becomes so excited with the purchase of Louisiana, because he believes that by adding that much territory to the continental United States, he has contributed to the preservation of peace and order in America for generations to come, because there's plenty of land there. There's no reason for revolt or revolution. There's plenty of opportunity, as long as you define opportunity in agricultural terms. Hamilton, on the other hand, recognized that a nation, in order to be respected, in order to be considered a major nation, an international power, as it were, needed to be self-sufficient. And Hamilton recognized that if we depended on England for our manufactured goods, by definition that made us vulnerable, because at any time England could shut us off. We did not control our access to manufactured goods. We had to depend on others for it. And Hamilton felt that by definition, dependence on other nations, on rival nations, equates with weakness. And that's why Hamilton believed that in order to become a truly respectable nation in the world of nations, we had to develop our own manufacturing capability. We had to break the dependency on English manufactured goods. That, of course, began when we were colonies. And after the revolution is over, we work very hard to try to gain access to British Empire markets once again in order to restore our commercial viability. And of course, England dumps manufactured goods on the American market in large part to prevent the creation of manufacturing industry within the United States. So England is playing a game here too. The point is that in order to be a powerful, respectable nation, Hamilton believed, we had to be independent. We could not be expected to gain respect and power and independence, real independence, so long as we were dependent on a rival nation for anything. We had to be able to satisfy our own needs. Dependency equals weakness. Independence equals strength. And that's kind of the way that Hamilton looked at the relations between nations. It's very Lockean. If you read John Locke, it's very Lockean. And basically Locke talked about the same things. About the issue of power and the extent to which dependency reduced a nation's power. So basically, and this is the point that Bob made, before we started today's program, and kind of suggested that it might be a good idea to go back here and develop this a little bit. What we're talking about here is the emergence of capitalism, of Western capitalism. And if you study the transition in Europe from the medieval period to the modern period, one of the major political changes that occurs is the emergence of the modern nation state. During the medieval period, during the Middle Ages, you didn't have nations as we know them today. You had regions and districts and kingdoms and princedoms and dukedoms, and that all we associate with the medieval period. But gradually, these regional areas tend to fall under the control of very powerful, influential families. And what you see throughout Europe gradually is the emergence of the modern nation state under a strong government, a king or a queen. And what you realize very quickly as well is that in this emerging modern world, which is beginning to look at the world from the perspective of capitalism, the success of these modern nations is directly tied to the success of its business community, of its middle classes. Because in the world of commerce and trade, the nation that can maintain or establish its independence by gaining access to whatever raw materials a nation might need leads logically to the founding or the establishment of colonies. Because colonies are, potentially at least, places where wealth might exist. And so you have the old image of this group getting out of a boat, that a canoe or whatever, that brings them to the shore, and planting the flag of the particular nation. I claim this in the name of Queen so-and-so or King so-and-so or whatever. And that's the whole nature of colonialism. The idea is that modern nation states, by definition, must have access to wealth, must have access, ready access, to raw materials. Because again, the reality of the way that the modern world, the so-called modern world view, is that independent nations are powerful nations, dependent nations are weak nations. Because if you are dependent on somebody else to supply something that you absolutely must have, then by definition you are always vulnerable. And so the emergence of modern nations on the continent of Europe results in a group of nation states, competitive nation states, each of them committed to the idea of exploiting the wealth and the natural resources of the world. And colonies are the places, are the sources of that wealth, which means they are the basis of the mother country's power, potentially. What Hamilton is doing in the early 90s, under the Washington administration, is laying the political groundwork, as you know, through this 5-part program, for making the United States a player on this world stage. And in order to do that, it's necessary that we experience quickly economic growth. But more important, it's important that this economic growth be balanced economic growth. Not just in agriculture, but in everything a modern nation must have in order to be powerful. So therefore, yes, we needed agriculture. But so also, Hamilton believed that we need manufacturing. If you look back to the colonial period, the agricultural colonies were the southern colonies. From the British Empire perspective, the southern colonies were perfect colonies. They produced wealth, they grew tobacco, they grew wheat, they grew rye or corn or whatever, and then they shipped it to the mother country. Timber, salt, ore, iron ore. The purpose of a colony was to support the industry and the economic growth of the mother country. But it's important to recognize that from the perspective of the mother country, this is not the mother country exploiting its own colonies. It's the mother country managing an empire. And an empire is a community. The thinking is that every element, every part of the empire has something to contribute to the strength of the whole. And if it's successful, then the economic viability of the mother country will extend out to benefit the colonies as well. In other words, the entire empire will grow together. This is the theory of so-called mercantilism. And a key player in mercantilism is government. Because if all of this power, all of this international power is to be driven by economic growth, then that makes the middle classes business critical. And so by definition then, there is this reciprocal dependency, if you will, between government and business. Government must support business in order to build the nation's power. Business must have the support of government in order to gain access to the areas which are potentially sources of wealth. And that's where the idea of charters come from for colonies. Charters are monopolies awarded to companies, corporations. So what we're talking about here from the get-go, from the very beginnings of capitalism, is this what some today would call insidious relationship between government and business. It's vital. And it's important to understand this because it's important to be able to put into perspective the attacks on government by business that we experience today in the Republican debates, for example, of 2 weeks ago. Well, that was it last week. I can't remember. There's been so much written about it. Seems like it was 6 months ago. But up and down the line, the argument is our government is too big, it's too regulatory, it's too restrictive, there's too much red tape, there's too much bureaucracy, it costs too much, it's too expensive, it's restraining freedom, it's limiting economic growth, it's retarding investment, it's doing all of those things. And so the conclusion that enough of that argument will cause, enough of Fox News over and over again will produce a mindset which suggests that government is bad. And therefore we must get rid of it. If you happen to see the interview this morning on Morning Joe with the Koch brothers, you heard the same thing about why government is so evil and so bad, and why libertarianism is so necessary, why freedom of business to operate is so critical in today's world. My point is it's important to be able to put this attack on government in perspective. The luxury that business would have of attacking government and seeking freedom from government regulation and government restrictions seems to suggest that government has no part to play in a world driven by capitalism. But the fact is, from the very beginning, it's only government itself that made capitalism even possible. Business, at least at the outset, wouldn't have the influence, the power, the money, or the ability to create the kind of infrastructure that business needs in order to engage in international commerce. The ports, the wharves, the ships, all of it. So if this is defined by government as a part of the public interest, in other words, if government defines the public interest as promoting economic growth, then government logically moves in order to subsidize and support those aspects of business which need supporting until they get off the ground. But the theory is, of course, that as business begins to flourish and become self-sufficient and is able to sustain itself, the thinking is that government will back off, or ought to back off, and loosen up the restrictions. Business's argument is that that doesn't happen unless you force government to do it. And that becomes the debate in today's world between liberals and conservatives, and that's what we're exposed to all the time. So in effect then, what I'm saying is that Hamilton's financial program is quite consistent with the emergence of capitalism in the modern world. But it's only capitalism so long as its major emphasis is commercial. When you get into manufacturing, when you move into the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, that's where you find the large industrialists advocating the theory or the philosophy of laissez-faire, of freedom. In other words, what they want government to get out of the way and give them their head and let business do whatever it feels it must do in order to be successful and competitive. Business has to reach a certain level of success before it's able to afford the luxury of telling government that we don't need you anymore. One of the most interesting things, I think, periods in American history in this vein, was the administration of Woodrow Wilson, and the extent to which Woodrow Wilson linked government up with business prior to World War I and made it possible for corporate interests and armaments businesses and all of that to profit from the war in Europe. To the point that at the end of the war, many people claimed that the reason we got into the war was to protect American investments and American arms manufacturers. I guess the point is that capitalism, by definition, is so driven by profit that whatever seems to promise profit becomes good, positive, legal, and acceptable. And ultimately, business claims the right to judge this for itself. In other words, business does not like the idea that government decides what's legal, what's legitimate, what's potentially good for investment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this particular issue is quite an important one. And I think because in today's world we hear so many attacks on government coming from the private sector that there is an inclination to believe that government is always bad and has no business being in the equation at all. The fact of the matter is, capitalism needs government. It needs government support. It needs government infrastructure. It needs government roads. It needs transportation systems. It needs government's military protection. It needs all of these things. And one of the most interesting periods, as I mentioned, in American history is at the turn of the 20th into the 20th century, after the Spanish-American War, when American business in a big way goes overseas into international investments, and the role that government plays in opening the doors to investors and financiers to economic prosperity. And I think that, America's rocky history with many of its Latin American neighbors, for example, in many ways is explained only by the aggressiveness with which American government, in support of business, literally opened markets and sources of raw materials that might not be there if government wasn't there to open them up. Theodore Roosevelt's approach to foreign policy, the idea of speak softly but carry a big stick. His basic theory is that one of government's jobs is to seek out international opportunity for business and to create investment opportunities for American investors. But Roosevelt points out that once government is successful in luring investors and luring business overseas, then government has a responsibility to protect those investments. And that's what gets us into a lot of our international embarrassments in our foreign wars, is government moving in to protect the investments of business, which government itself was instrumental in putting there in the first place. And the role that government has played in toppling governments, unfriendly governments that won't let us in, that won't let American corporations in. And, you know, there's a whole story here with foreign policy. But I think the issue, and I don't want to lose the focus on the issue is the reciprocal relationship between business and government that exists from the very beginning of the establishment of commercial capitalism during the so-called mercantilist phase, which is the earliest phase of capitalist development. And it's important to, I think I mentioned yesterday, it's important to recognize that this was the phase of industrial development, this was the phase of capitalist development that much of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations was about. It was focused principally on international trade and commerce. What industry there was local industry, and of course that's where he has his famous stories about the, about the pins, about the price and how supply and demand sets the price for pins and all these other things. So that's the way the free market works. But for the most part, manufacturing at this point is domestic. It's commerce, it's trade that is international in the period, the late 19th century, during the period, late 18th century rather, in which Adam Smith writes. So I think this is particularly significant. Okay, and one further point in this. I shared this quote before, yesterday in fact, but I want to repeat it because I think it really pulls together a lot of this stuff. It is the article entitled Alexander Hamilton, Nation Maker, written by Rexford Tugwell and Joseph Dorfman in 1939. And it specifically references Hamilton's program as an example of building a modern nation. And these authors say as follows: the reports of Hamilton in 1790 and 91 taken together constitute a theoretical plan which is just beginning to be appreciated. The economic organization logically involved was grand and imperial in scope. A fully negotiable funded debt, drained originally from the small property classes and met by taxes paid by the masses, was to be used by an emerging moneyed class to create profitable speculative enterprises in lands, industry, and finance, unquote. This is the model that these people believe the Roosevelt administration should move towards during the New Deal in order to pull the nation out of the recession. In other words, an activist government, a government that is directly involved in economic planning. And of course, in trying to do this, Roosevelt establishes what we today call the safety net with programs like Social Security and minimum wage and unemployment insurance and FDI, the creation of federal deposit insurance corporations so that people wouldn't lose their homes during financial downturns and all the rest of it. Roosevelt recognizes that one of the major factors associated with successful economic growth is to create the idea amongst everybody in your society that they all matter, that everybody matters, we're in this together, everybody's got a job to do, and we're all working towards the same goal. And of course, we know that many prominent business people called Roosevelt a communist and a socialist and everything else. And he was attacked viciously for some of his New Deal proposals. And in one of his most famous responses at a press conference, Roosevelt says, "Some of my attackers are calling this radicalism, communism." He said, "This isn't communism. This is the shrewdest form of capitalism." And what he's talking about is the reestablishment in America of a viable working relationship between government and the private sector. And maintaining that balance has been the struggles that the nation has fought for in the last 75, 80 years since the New Deal. Trying to strike the proper, what people believe to be the proper balance between how much government and when does it become too much government, and how much freedom on the part of corporations, and when does that become too much freedom? And what happens to the safety net? What happens to the people at the bottom in that kind of a situation? And of course, that's the debate we have today between the large group of Republican candidates on the one hand, as they accuse each other of not being conservative enough, and on the other hand, you have the Bernie Sanders approach, which is pretty far left, and then you have the Hillary Clinton approach, her effort to try to take some of Sanders' most popular ideas and pull them more towards the center. But it's the same debate. And the reality is that there will be government. There has to be government. The debate always is how much. Or to put it another way, how much is too much. What we began to address yesterday briefly was the issue of political parties. There's absolutely no doubt that the ingredients of Hamilton's program become the basis for the emergence of a Republican opposition party, which becomes the so-called Jeffersonian Republicans, later to be just the Jeffersonians. And there's absolutely no question that if you buy into the belief, and I do, that the differences between Federalists and Anti-Federalists pretty much disappeared under the Washington administration, especially with the ratification of the Bill of Rights. Parties, as existed in the struggle over ratification, pretty much disappeared. If you accept that, then you have to believe that the parties which emerged in the 1790s were not continuations of the Federalist anti-Federalist struggle, but they were new parties created for totally separate, independent reasons. And there's no question that the principal reason was Hamilton's programs. And that Jefferson, along with John Beckley in the House of Representatives, began to successfully organize the opposition to Hamilton's program into what becomes a viable political alternative within the central government, within Congress. There's no question, in other words, that the emergence of our two-party system begins within government itself. It begins in Congress. And it's reflected in the very partisan votes on specific aspects of Hamilton's program. That's where the emergence of parties becomes most clear, is in the extent to which members of Congress begin to vote together on issues more and more and more. And you begin to see the gradual split in Congress between those that are going to become Federalists, those that are Federalists, and those that are going to become Republicans. And you can see the votes. You look at the votes on assumption. You look at the votes on the bank. And you can begin to see that there's an emerging party structure taking shape within Congress. And it's principally James Madison and John Beckley who take on the responsibility of organizing that opposition into something that's viable. But the thinking is, the assumption is at the beginning that what you are talking about are coalitions within Congress in order to establish bargaining power over specific aspects of Hamilton's program. I mean, just as Hamilton was able to use the location of the national capital as a bargaining chip to get the assumption bill through, so also Beckley and Madison envisioned a situation that if we can line up enough congressmen who agree and are willing to consistently vote with us, then we will have enough voting power within Congress to block the legislation we don't like and demand compromise, demand concessions. So at least in the early period, parties have not gone beyond the walls of Congress. But it's not very far into the 1790s before that begins to change, and change dramatically. And there's absolutely no question that while Hamilton's program sows the seeds of a two-party system in America, it's foreign policy that feeds those seeds into full-blown political parties. More specifically, the renewed war between Great Britain and France. The Republicans, Jefferson particularly, the Republicans tend to put their support behind France. Hamilton and the Federalists, based principally in the Northeast in manufacturing and banking urban areas, naturally see America's best interests tied up in, realized in close alliance with England. And differences over that split on foreign party tend to solidify the parties that have formed over the elements of Hamilton's financial program. But there's one other factor here that I think it's important to recognize about foreign policy and the emergence of parties. And that is that foreign policy issues tend to bring the population at large into the political picture. It's not possible to contain party development and party growth and party loyalty within Congress once the debate begins to focus on alliances with England on the one hand or with France on the other. Most people, most citizens, believe that we do indeed have a debt to France. It was France that helped us win our independence. In 1778, we developed an alliance with France. And in that alliance, we agreed that we would not bring the war for independence to an end without France. In other words, we would not leave France hanging. And we also said that if England and France ever went to war again, we would be committed to support France. And even though the French government changes by the early 90s as a result of the outbreak of the French Revolution and the use of the guillotine, those in power in France believe that the United States is still committed under the alliance of 1778 to support France in the early 90s. And Jefferson and Madison want to. Their supporters want to. The masses of the people want to. But those interests linked directly to Hamilton and the Federalists do not. There's no question then that it's the evolution or the development of foreign policy issues through the 1790s that really feed the growth of parties in America to the point that they become a factor in the presidential election of 1796, the election of John Adams to replace President Washington as President of the United States. And full-blown parties become a key ingredient in the election of 1800 that elects Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson referred to his election in 1800 as a revolution. And what he meant by that is that this is the first time in the history of the modern world that power, political power, has transferred from one group to another without violence, without bloodshed. There's absolutely no question that the election of 1800, the election of Jefferson, goes a long way towards planting the idea of what political scientists call, the concept of a loyal opposition. The idea that it's possible to have legitimate disagreement and legitimate political debate in a country without going to war over it. In Jefferson's inaugural, in 1800, he makes the very famous statement that we are all Republicans, we are all Democrats. What he's basically saying in his inaugural address, it's time to put the political differences that drove the election to rest. It's time that we all came together as Americans. There's absolutely no question. This is one of the essay questions that I used to ask students in a college class to wrestle with on an exam. That is, I would ask students to examine the major issues in Jefferson's first term from 1801 to 1804 until he's reelected in the election of 1804. And basically the question I asked is, if you had been an avid supporter of Thomas Jefferson in the election of 1800, would you have been satisfied with Jefferson's performance during his first administration, or would you have been mad as hell? And of course, the implication of the question was that Jefferson makes changes, yes, but they aren't nearly the changes that his supporters believed that his victory would produce. People who supported Jefferson believed, naturally, that when he won the White House, all Federalist office holders would be out of jobs. He would wipe the slate clean and get rid of everybody that served in the Adams administration or that had supported the policies and programs of Alexander Hamilton in the 90s. There's no question that Jefferson does make changes. But on the other hand, he as an example, he doesn't set about terminating or destroying the United States Bank. The bank was created with a 20-year charter. That charter does not come up until 1819. Jefferson doesn't take on the bank the minute he takes over. And this statement that we are all Republicans, we are all Democrats, by definition suggests compromise. It suggests the reality that what appear to be critically important major differences between Republicans and Federalists in the election really aren't all that important differences when push comes to shove. There's room for negotiation and compromise. There's wiggle room. We can make some changes, but we don't have to make wholesale changes. And that election of 1800 establishes the idea, the principle, that loyal opposition is possible. So I guess the question I have, and this is the question I want to throw out as we're moving towards the end of our program. We've got about 15 minutes left in our program. The issue that I'd like to throw out here is why compromise? Why negotiation? What had changed? What was the difference between the parties of the early 90s and the elections that were going on in the late 90s that brought Thomas Jefferson to the office of president? And it seems to me that the principal difference is the involvement of the masses of the American people. Americans become caught up not only in the election, but in the issues themselves. They begin to debate and argue the issues. The American people become politically involved in the process. They become players in their own political world, if you will. Unlike the late 80s, when the Constitution was ratified, and the early 90s, which saw the rise of political parties within Congress, once the American people get involved, they are not willing to allow these decisions to be made within Congress itself. These are decisions they want some say in. They feel like they have the right. It's a popular government. It's a republic. Our elected representatives are supposed to listen to us. So the American people become deeply involved in the issues which are feeding the development of political parties. And from the organizational level, from the top levels looking down, let me be specific here. From James Madison's perspective in Congress, and then as Secretary of State under Jefferson, Madison realizes that the involvement of the masses in political debate and discord in America could sink the republic. Because Hamilton and Washington were arguing that parties were bad. Parties were divisive. And that they shouldn't be allowed. And Hamilton's position was, this is a republic. This is the people's government. Once the people select the government, then it's the responsibility of the people to obey the laws and obey the policies of that government. Not to do so is treason and ought to subject you to arrest. There's no concept, no idea of the principle of loyal opposition. The assumption is, in a popular government, in a republic, you support the people's government or you become an enemy to that government. After reading the Federalist Papers, especially the ones written by James Madison, there's absolutely no question in my mind that Madison sees the danger to that. And I believe, and all of this is interpretation because I can't put my fingers on a letter where Madison specifically says this. All you can do is try to build the case where it seems to make sense and become the most logical conclusion. It is my belief that once the political debates which are causing the separation of parties becomes a public debate, once the masses of the people become involved in politics, Madison realizes that the inability of the Constitution to accommodate dissent in this nation threatens the viability and the very existence of the republic itself. If we don't find a way to accommodate dissent and disagreement, if we don't find a way to turn dissent inward into the system rather than driving the dissenters out of the systems by defining them as criminals, then the Constitution as written can't survive. Because there will be disagreements, there will be differences of opinion. And the differences of opinion in the 1790s over issues related to the war between England and France suggest that the people are becoming deeply emotionally involved in American foreign policy and the decisions of the Washington administration. The people are watching. Washington is almost driven out of office over the Jay Treaty because the Jay Treaty appears to be a 100% victory for England. It's considered to be one of the most unpopular treaties that the United States ever negotiated and ever got through the Senate of the United States. And the only reason it got through the Senate of the United States is because President Washington put his entire reputation on the line in favor of it. In the 90s, 1792, 93, 94, around the time of the Whiskey Rebellion, not only is the federal government enforcing its will with military force in western Pennsylvania over the excise tax, but a representative of the French government named Citizen Genet arrives in the United States and begins to organize pro-France groups within the United States on the assumption that the United States is committed to support France under the alliance of 1778. And this creates tremendous discord within the Washington administration and tremendous debate. Genet embarrasses the hell out of Thomas Jefferson, who's arguing he's carrying France's water in the administration. But for Genet to come and act like a brute and a bore makes it impossible for Jefferson to continue to support the efforts of Genet. and it becomes impossible to stop Washington from issuing his very famous neutrality proclamation. Recognizing, of course, that to declare neutrality in the war between England and France is, in effect, to contradict the terms of the alliance of 1778. So even though neutrality looks like a middle compromise position, it's actually a pro-Hamilton position, because in declaring neutrality, Washington is saying we are not going to honor the terms of the alliance of 1778 with France. During this period, a series of public meetings emerges throughout the country. The textbooks refer to these as Democratic Republican societies, debating societies. They spring up all over the country, mostly in the cities. Obviously, New England, Newport, Providence, Boston, Worcester. Many of the cities, New York, Philadelphia. But many societies emerge in the South as well. Charleston, South Carolina, for example. And heated debates over America's proper role in the world are happening in these democratic societies. More and more people are getting involved in politics. The two parties, each of them has taken on their own newspapers. They have their own party organs, their own newspapers that tout their political position, almost like Fox News, touting the position of Republican conservatives. The people are inflamed. The people are fired up. The people are involved in politics. I believe that Madison's role in organizing that opposition and in fashioning what becomes the Jeffersonian Republican Party is acknowledgement by him that not to find a way to accommodate dissent within this nation will destroy it. I believe that Madison recognizes that the non-mention of political parties in the Constitution of the United States is an error. The difference is, it's a different kind of political party that Madison begins to support. Not the parties which equate to factions that he warned so much about at the time of the Constitution. He's talking about political parties as being amorphous, debating societies that educate the public in civic education and bring them to the polls in order to become participants in the political process in their own government. I would argue that the behavior and the activities of Madison in the 1790s related to the development of the Republican Party opposition to Hamilton and to the Federalists in the Washington administration. I believe that this is a recognition that Madison has bought into a totally different definition of republicanism. No longer is this the republicanism of Montesquieu. The republicanism based on the idea that the people voice their opinion and the representatives carry it out. The ratification of the Constitution theoretically settled that. But there's no way that citizens are going to allow these kinds of decisions and these kinds of issues to be decided totally or exclusively within the government, within Congress. People want to be involved. And Madison becomes a fan, a supporter of mechanisms, reforms designed to involve more people in the political process in a totally different approach to the formation of political parties, an approach that became clear through the experiences of the 1790s and the election of Thomas Jefferson in 1800. A political process which would engage people in elections, in the debates, in the activities, in the political association, the political education, rather, that is associated with political education and political campaigns. But these parties would be amorphous groups. They would be designed in such a way that they didn't drive people out, they brought people in. They became more and more inclusive. But in order to become more inclusive, that meant that they had to accommodate the points of view of more different groups, more people, different people. So that meant that the parties, by definition, couldn't be too definitive on their agendas. Oh yeah, you can support things like clean air and peace and harmony and love and negotiation and all these things that everybody's for. But when it gets down to the really controversial stuff that people disagreed over, these parties usually tried to walk a fine line between them and not take a definitive position. Consequently, as more and more people became involved in the political process, the issues that they discussed and debated became more and more amorphous and less definitive as the campaign went on. To the point that when the election happened and one party won and the other party lost, then the number one agenda of the winning party was to reach across the aisle and promise to do everything possible to work with the opposition. That becomes our contemporary two-party system. It emerges out of experiences and necessities of the 1790s. I think that we owe a vote of credit to James Madison for his role in creating this. I don't think this violates the positions Madison took in the 1780s at all. I think it indicates rather that he was continuing to grow and continuing to learn and continuing to adjust and make changes in his positions. I think the creation of the two-party system is brilliant. It is the end of our program. It is 59 minutes after the hour, and boy, that hour and a half flies by for me, because once I get into this stuff, it's just gone. I want to thank you so much for tuning in today, and I hope that you'll be back with us tomorrow here at the Virtual Center. We'll begin tomorrow at our regular time, which is 1 p.m. in the East. We'll have our full 2-hour program. In the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful evening. Enjoy this gorgeous weather. Be safe. Please be kind to each other. And hopefully you'll be able to join us tomorrow here at the Virtual Center. This is Bill O'Brien thanking you so very much. Have a good day.